Good evening, everybody. My name's Matt Lobdell. I'm the curator of collections here at the Morton Arboretum, and I'm excited to greet you all virtually tonight, the perennial partners, and give you a little bit of an overview of what we're doing here at the Arboretum. I'm sure many of you have had a chance to come visit, but I thought instead of just doing a PowerPoint, I could actually show you some of the trees we have out here and talk about some of the things we're doing. So in case you haven't figured it out yet, we're actually standing here in the oak collection. As most of you know, oaks are a big group of interest for us at the Arboretum, and it's one we've done some extensive collecting and planting of in the past several years. Unfortunately, this year we've also continued to lose some of the several mature oaks that we have in the collection. If you look behind me, you can unfortunately see the remains of the last remaining mature white oak in this particular area. And this died over the winter, mostly due to probably some damage from the 2013 drought, where the root loss was just a little bit too severe for a mature tree like that to recover from, as well as some cankers that sort of came in after the fact. So it's always a shame to see some of these older, more mature trees die, but it's unfortunately something we have to deal with very often when we talk about curating living collections of plants, right? Every tree is going to have a lifespan, but for every dead tree, we can plant more new trees, and we can have a lot more mid-range trees. Like, for example, this oak right next to me, this is actually a native oak. This is in pretty good shape. This is a Quercus coccinea, or a scarlet oak. You can see this probably went in about the 70s or so. It's a maturing specimen, so it looks fairly good right now. As I was mentioning, we've done a lot of extensive new planting here to replace a lot of the trees that we've lost over the past several years. For example, if you look behind me, you can see a few new, really young, immature bur oaks, which is a native species here in Illinois. Now, many of these bur oaks we have actually came from populations a little bit further north in Minnesota, but I expect them still to be good additions to the collection. Now, sometimes it's hard to justify, right, removing such a large tree and replacing it with a very small tree. But when you plant oaks at this small of a size, really more or less the diameter of your thumb, they actually can grow very quickly because they haven't really dealt with the root loss that can happen from digging a more mature specimen from a nursery here, or having a big ball and burlap specimen. So these will actually probably start to grow and establish in the collection fairly quickly. In another 15 to 20 years, there'll be some of those more intermediate trees, and they'll eventually become those more mature trees we'll have for future generations. We actually had one of the most extensive years of planting in the collections since maybe the early 2000s or even the late 80s. We added 700 trees to the plant collections, and many of them oaks, and many of them were also in our geographic collections, which I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to what we're doing there a little bit later. In addition to more common oak trees like white oaks and bur oaks, at the Arboretum we also experiment with growing species of oaks which are less commonly cultivated or not always available in horticulture. This is an example of one such oak which actually does quite well here at the Arboretum. So this is Quercus marylandica, or the blackjack oak. I first learned this when I was living in Delaware, but it's not really a southern tree per se. It actually has a pretty broad range. But it has a rather unique looking leaf where it has these three lobes that are really pronounced at the apex, or the end of the leaf. And it's you can find it in Illinois really in sandy areas. When you start to get to central Illinois, it's a little bit further south. And it kind of grows in these sandy type habitats. And as a member of the red or the black oak group, its acorns take 2 years to mature as opposed to 1. So we'll see, these are the acorns which will actually probably mature next year. But it's good to see these trees fruiting and healthy, and this will be continue to be a great addition to our collection in the future. When I first came to the Arboretum about 6 years ago, I was very surprised to hear we had actually grown a rare species of oak in our collections, and that's the Oglethorpe oak. It's a rare southern species. It's named for Oglethorpe County in Georgia, which is not far from Athens, or where UGA is located. And I thought maybe it was in a really protected area, it was very anomalous, but no, there's actually one fairly mature tree in the Thornhill area, which is about 40 years old. So when I started here as curator, it actually had died a few months before I began. So so I kind of made it my effort to try to get as many Oglethorpe oaks as I could to try to get that species going again here at the Arboretum. And it's a species which is considered endangered. It's red listed. So really by learning how to grow it here, we're also helping with conservation. And it has a leaf that you wouldn't think of really being typical for an oak tree. It has little to no lobing. I mean, some of the leaves do, just the ones that are really young and growing very vigorously. But it's such a nice looking species. And as it gets a little bit older and more mature, it'll actually develop this nice white, platy bark, which can look really interesting too. So definitely keep an eye on this Oglethorpe oak here in the oak collection, as well as many other additions across the property in future years, and it would be exciting to watch these grow as time goes on. Another rare or endangered species in our oak collection is the Georgia oak. So this, or Quercus georgiana, it only grows in a few select habitats in the southeastern US. It's in Georgia, as the name would suggest, and in Stone Mountain and a few other smaller localities. It also occurs in Alabama in a few populations too. But these actually did come from Stone Mountain, and a lot of people are surprised to see this doing as well as it's doing in our collections. It's not really thought to be the hardiest tree, but of course it's survived with little to no damage through some of the really harsh winters we've had over the past 7 or 8 years. Made it through that really bad winter we had from 2013 to 2014, and it made it down to when we got about -23 in that 2018 to 19 winter. So similar to what I was talking about with the blackjack oak, this is a member of the black or the red oak group, and I was actually really excited to see this both this year and last year, but it's actually beginning to produce acorns. And this is exciting because it means as we start thinking about establishing larger groves of this tree on our property as time goes on, we may actually be able to create a breeding population of Georgia oak here at the Arboretum, which could be useful for helping with reintroduction efforts and making the species a little bit less rare in the wild as time goes on. Though I certainly wish I was giving you all a tour in person. One advantage of doing this more virtually is I can actually very quickly get you to some of the more remote parts of the property. So we're out here by the old by a service road. We're not too far from Joe the Guardian. The nursery's right in front of me. But this is the site of our mature maple leaf oak, or Quercus acerifolia. This is another rare and endangered species. It really only grows in the Ozarks and a few sites in Arkansas. And it's named the maple leaf oak because the leaves look a little bit more like a maple than they do an oak. You can see they're a little bit wider, maybe wider than they are long in some cases. Again, this grows in high to mid elevation, these areas of very good drainage on mountainsides and that sort of thing. But it's actually done very well in cultivation here, and it's another species of which we're really hoping to introduce these larger grove-type plantings here at the Arboretum, which will allow people to maybe see this tree a little bit more easily than they can in this particular area. So we've now left the oak collection and have entered the Eastern U.S. collection, or the Eastern North America collection. So in this collection, instead of arranging trees and other plants based on which group or what type of plant they are, we arrange them based on what flora they belong to, where they occur spontaneously in the world. And many of these shrubs that I'm standing around here, these are new additions to the collection, which are made predominantly by a collecting trip I did in the southeast in 2015. So for example, this shrub next to me here, this is a native euonymus, and one of the names for it is sometimes hearts a bursting, which is actually relating to its fruit. So it's not quite mature yet, but as this fruit opens, you'll see the seeds are green now, but they'll be a really bright, brilliant orange when they actually do come out of emerge from the capsule, which makes a very ornamental look for this particular plant. So a lot of these shrubs, again, came from a trip I did in Alabama, and then another trip which was done in Kentucky and Tennessee in 2017. But most of these are recent plantings from the last year or two. So shrubs grow a little bit faster than trees, but still as woody plants, they take a little bit of time to get from seed up to a mature plant. But we have very good provenance or documentation about all of these trees and shrubs and where they came from. We knew which state park or which natural area they were growing within. We know which types of plants they were growing around. We know a lot about the type of soil and the drainage, and which specific GPS coordinate each one of these seeds was collected from. And this really helps increase the value of our collections, because when we start thinking about performing research or some really detailed trials of these plants, we just know a lot more about these plants and where they came from. Because sometimes trees and shrubs don't necessarily perform the same, depending on from what part of the range they came from. We might have a shrub in Alabama that's not hardy, but a shrub from Illinois that is hardy, even though they're from the same species. But the advantage of going down south, as we have been for the past few years, is a lot of these trees and shrubs from that part of the country might actually still have genetics and resistance for cold. They might be able to withstand cold winters, but also be able to withstand the hot, humid summers that we tend to have in this area as well. It can sometimes be difficult to give tours of the collections at this time of year because, a lot of plants have finished flowering. But fortunately, there are still a few that will hold flowers a little bit later into the summer. And one great example of this is the oak leaf hydrangea, right? Many of us already know about this plant, but again, this is one of my collections from Alabama in 2015, and I was particularly impressed to see the size of this flower right here. So this is a seed collection which is flowering at only about 5 years old. It was pretty fast growing. And a lot of the cultivars of oak leaf hydrangea you see are usually more introduced for the garden setting, right? So they tend to be smaller, much more compact. This shrub, I'm not quite sure how big it will get, but many oak leaf hydrangeas can get up to 10 feet tall in some situations if they're well cared for. This could very well be on track for that. But also one thing I like about this tree is it will flower pretty abundantly in shade. So even in these heavy shade conditions, some of these mature red oaks and some other hickories and buckeyes we have in this area, it's still able to put on a pretty good flower set. And definitely enjoyable for people who are walking through this trail as they walk through the collections. In addition to many of the new plantings we've been talking about, there are also many expansions in the eastern U.S., or at that point the Appalachia collection, which were done in the early 2000s. This is a shrub here that I get a lot of questions about. This is a Staphylea, or bladdernut. And why people tend to be curious about it is they notice these very odd-looking fruits that tend to come up at this time of year. So these are actually the fruits. It's sort of an inflated capsule. As you open these up, you'll see that there's a few seeds inside. And these again tend to occur in wetter areas, so the fruit will fall off and wash down the river a little bit further downstream. It will float and remain intact. So the bladdernut, Staphylea trifoliata, is a neat plant in this area. Another tree I like, which is a little bit hard for us to grow at the Arboretum, is this moosewood, or Acer pennsylvanicum. So it tends to grow in fairly high elevation throughout most of the U.S. I remember seeing a lot of this up in Vermont, upstate New York, that type of area. I think it can struggle a little bit with the hot summers and the humid summers that we tend to have here. But you can see it's got this, that classic maple leaf where it doesn't look exactly like the Canadian flag. It's a little bit differently shaped, but it's still a pretty interesting looking leaf. And also, this one here is actually fruiting. You can see these clusters of the samaras, or the helicopter type fruits that will fall out and be wind dispersed as the year goes on. So this can, as I was saying earlier, can sometimes be a difficult time to do tours of the collections because there's not a lot of things flowering and we're really in the early fruiting season for many of these plants. It's hard for me to believe with how fast it seems like this year has gone by that we're already almost towards the end of the growing season. Another 6 weeks or so we'll be talking about fall. But you can see a lot of trees are maybe just starting to produce their fruits for the year. This is the immature fruit off of this umbrella tree, or Magnolia tripetala, which is behind me. You can see it almost starts off as this pale, whitish, maybe a pink color. It'll actually turn a brilliant red as the year goes on, which can be quite ornamental, particularly when the orange seeds start to emerge out of this. But yeah, so we've seen a few things today where we looked at the oak collection and we looked at some unfortunate larger trees which are being removed, as well as some newer plantings which are coming in to start to replace them. And then we've looked at an area like this eastern U.S. collection, where the collection itself is expanding quite a bit to better suit the needs of the Arboretum and the mission as things go on forward. It can sometimes be difficult to really study tree and shrub collections because they can seem almost stagnant if you don't know what to look for, right? It's not really the most actively changing landscape. But as many of you all who visit regularly are certainly aware, if you know what to look for, there really can be a lot of changes in the collections as time goes on. It can be really rewarding to see just the Arboretum change and grow over time as it continues to expand in scope and better fit its mission. Thank you everyone for your attention.